Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
Thank you for joining us.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show. The hit that wouldn't stay. Buried, the NFL's war on brain science.
It is quite a topic.
I am Alex.
And I am Sam.
So, to start us off, I want you to imagine discovering a microscopic biological mechanism that fundamentally threatens a $20 billion American institution.
Right.
And then imagine that your reward for finding it is this 15-year scorched earth campaign to just erase your research from existence.
Yeah, it's wild.
Today, our mission in this deep dive is to unpack an astonishing timeline of institutional resistance, groundbreaking scientific discovery, and the rapidly changing landscape of America's most popular sport.
Exactly.
We're drawing entirely from an incredibly detailed body of source material that traces what happens when a massive cultural juggernaut basically collides with undeniable medical reality.
And to really understand the magnitude of this, we have to start exactly where our material begins.
Right, not in a stadium.
No, not in a boardroom either, but in a very visceral, tragic setting. It's September 2002, and we are in a coroner's office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
On the stainless steel table is the body of a 50-year-old man. And in Pittsburgh, this specific man isn't just a citizen. He is absolute royalty.
We're talking about Mike Webster, right?
Yes, Iron Mike. The legendary Hall of Fame center who anchored the offensive line for the Pittsburgh Steelers through 4 Super Bowl championships back in the 1970s.
A 9-time Pro Bowler.
Exactly. This is a man who spent 17 grueling seasons absorbing and delivering just unimaginable violence on every single play. But if you were looking at the man on that table in 2002, you would not see a gridiron hero.
Not even a shadow of one.
Right. The documentation of Mike Webster's final years in our source text paints a portrait of just profound, agonizing disintegration.
It's incredibly tough to read.
It really is. By the time he passed away, he had spent the better part of a decade experiencing cognitive and personal collapse. We are talking about a man who earned 4 Super Bowl rings, yet ended up broke, frequently homeless, and, sleeping in his pickup truck.
Suffering from terrifying blackouts.
Extreme paranoia. And there is a detail in our source material that is genuinely difficult to process, but you have to hear it to understand the depths of his suffering.
The teeth.
Yeah. He was using a super glue gun to cement his own rotting teeth back into his skull.
Oh my God.
He was completely alienated from his family, just trapped in a mind that was quite literally turning on him.
And he ultimately died of a heart attack. But there's a crucial medical distinction here that the text makes right at the outset.
Right. The heart attack was merely the final physical insult.
Yeah, because the reality is that Mike Webster's brain had been destroyed long before his heart actually stopped beating. He had been hollowed out, basically neuron by neuron.
And the doctor performing this autopsy is a forensic pathologist named Dr. Bennet Omalu.
And the context of who Omalu is plays a massive role in how this entire saga unfolds, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He is Nigerian-born. He did not grow up steeped in the mythology of American football. He was a soccer fan.
So when Webster's body arrived in his morgue, he didn't immediately recognize the cultural weight of the name on the chart.
Exactly. And it seems to me that this ignorance, and I mean that in the most positive sense of the word, like a lack of reverence for the NFL shield was his greatest asset.
Right, because he could just look at it objectively.
Exactly. He allowed himself to look at Webster's brain purely as biological tissue. He wasn't looking at a sacred relic of American sports. He was looking at an organ that had failed.
That objective distance was absolutely critical. So when Omalu sections Webster's brain and stains the tissue for microscopic examination, what is he expecting to find?
Well, he expects to find something resembling Alzheimer's disease or maybe profound generalized dementia, given the severe cognitive decline Webster had exhibited.
Right.
But that isn't what he finds at all. Instead, he discovers these clusters of an abnormal protein called tau.
Okay, we need to break down how tau works because this is fascinating.
It is. So think of the neurons in your brain like a vast, complex railway system carrying vital supplies back and forth.
A railway system.
Under normal conditions, tau protein acts like the structural scaffolding that holds those microscopic train tracks together.
It keeps everything stable.
Right. But under extreme stress like repeated, violent physical trauma, that tau protein breaks off. It folds abnormally and begins to clump together.
Oh, wow.
It literally clumps onto those tracks, physically blocking the supply chains. So the neurons eventually starve, suffocate, and die.
That is terrifying.
It really is. And Omalu sees this tau distributed in a pattern that simply does not match any textbook description of Alzheimer's.
Right.
It's clustered with this peculiar, terrifying density around the brain's small blood vessels and tucked deep into the folds of the cortex. He realizes, staring through that microscope, that he is looking at an entirely new disease.
Well, new in this specific context anyway.
Exactly.
Which brings up the subtitle of the source text we are analyzing today, the NFL, CTE, and 15 years of engineered doubt. Because finding a disease in a lab is one thing, right? Getting the world and a multi-billion-dollar industry to accept it is a completely different war.
A massive war.
But I want to pivot back to something you just said. You mentioned this was a new disease in this specific context.
Yeah.
Because the concept of brain damage from getting hit in the head wasn't entirely novel, was it?
No, not at all.
Our material takes us all the way back to 1928 to a New Jersey pathologist named Harrison Martland. He identified a condition in boxers that he called punch-drunk syndrome.
Right, which the medical community later named dementia pugilistica.
Exactly. It described the progressive neurological deterioration, the tremors, the slurred speech, the memory loss in men who had taken years of blows to the head in the ring.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this, the obvious question you have to be asking yourself is this. If the medical community clearly recognized that boxers were getting punch-drunk all the way back in 1928, how on earth did American football coast for another 75 years acting like it was completely immune to this exact same physics?
It's a great question.
It's like an entire culture bought into this magic armor myth. The idea that because football players wore hard plastic helmets, the basic laws of physics and traumatic brain injury had somehow been miraculously bypassed.
That magic armor myth is precisely the psychological backdrop that allowed this to go unchecked for so long.
Right.
Because boxing's explicit, stated goal is to concuss the opponent, to knock them out. So the medical risks seemed self-evidently contained to that one specific, often marginalized combat sport.
Sure, it makes intuitive sense.
But football had built an entire architecture of protective equipment. The evolution of the hard plastic helmet implied safety. It offered the illusion of a solved problem.
An illusion.
Yes. So when Omalu finds this specific pattern of tau-driven destruction, which he and his colleagues would eventually name chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, in the brain of one of the NFL's most iconic players, it's an explosive moment.
It changes everything.
It implies that the foundational mythology of football safety was essentially false advertising. It meant the fundamental mechanism of the game itself, the repeated high-velocity collisions that happen on every single down, carried a long-term neurological cost that no one had ever honestly evaluated or disclosed.
So Omalu makes this massive biological discovery, and he does what any responsible scientist does, right?
Yeah.
He writes a paper.
Naturally.
He submits his findings to the highly respected medical journal Neurosurgery in 2005. But the response he gets isn't a parade. It isn't even a standard, rigorous academic debate. The review process is described in the text as exceptionally brutal and highly unusual.
To call it unusual is, frankly, an understatement. In the scientific community, publishing a single case report based on one autopsy is generally viewed as a modest endeavor.
Right, it's just a starting point.
It's a flag planted in the ground saying, hey, look at this anomaly, we should investigate this further. It is rarely treated as a battlefield.
But it was a battlefield for Omalu.
It was. When he submitted this paper, it was subjected to nearly 20 separate peer reviews.
20?
20. The scrutiny was relentless, and many of those reviewers aggressively argued that the paper shouldn't be published at all.
Unbelievable.
To get it through, Omalu's written responses to these reviewers ended up being roughly 5 times longer than his original manuscript.
Wow.
He had to fight for every single syllable.
And when you look at the venue itself, the journal Neurosurgery, it becomes clear that Omalu was walking into a trap.
Oh, absolutely.
This wasn't neutral ground. The text notes that this publication had previously published a series of articles by researchers heavily affiliated with the National Football League.
Right.
And those early articles had spent years minimizing the concussion problem.
Yeah.
They referred to these devastating impacts as merely mild traumatic brain injury.
Mild?
Yeah, they even published guidelines supporting the idea of sending a concussed player back onto the football field on the exact same day they were injured, which we now know is incredibly dangerous due to second impact syndrome.
It's lethal.
So Omalu is submitting findings that prove catastrophic long-term brain rot directly to a journal where his work is going to be reviewed by the very establishment whose prior conclusions he is completely dismantling.
And that establishment wasn't just a loose collection of doctors. It was a very specific, highly coordinated organization.
Tell us about them.
Back in 1994, then NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue created something called the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, or the MTBI.
Okay.
When Omalu's paper miraculously survives the gauntlet and gets published in 2005, the chair of that NFL committee, a man named Dr. Elliot Pellman, along with two of his colleagues, wrote a blistering letter to the journal.
And they didn't just disagree, right?
No, they didn't just write a critical response to Foster debate, which is normal protocol. They directly demanded the outright retraction of Omalu's peer-reviewed paper.
They wanted it unpublished.
Yes. They tried to have it erased from the scientific record entirely, effectively memory holing the existence of CTE.
We absolutely need to pause and put Dr. Elliot Pellman under the microscope because the details surrounding this man in our source material are just staggering.
They really are.
He is the chairman of the National Football League's Brain Injury Committee, the man in charge of investigating the greatest neurological threat to the sport. But he is not a neurologist.
Nope.
He is not a neuropathologist. He is a rheumatologist.
Yes, a disjoint doctor.
A joint, tissue, and arthritis doctor. He was the team doctor for the New York Jets, managing bad knees and sprained ankles. Putting a rheumatologist in charge of a multi-billion-dollar league's traumatic brain injury division is like putting a podiatrist in charge of open heart surgery. It makes zero sense.
It fundamentally strains credulity. Rheumatology is obviously a serious medical subspecialty, but its practitioners will be the first to tell you it has absolutely nothing to do with neuropathology or the neurochemistry of the human brain.
So how did he get the job?
Well, the provenance of Pellman's appointment adds a deeply cynical layer to the story. Why was this specific doctor chosen?
Right.
Pellman had served as Commissioner Paul Tagliabue's personal physician for nearly a decade.
There it is.
Now, Tagliabue later tried to claim he only really knew Pellman casually through his work with the Jets, but insiders noted that was incredibly difficult to square with their established, long-term doctor-patient relationship. Pellman was a trusted loyalist.
A loyalist with a highly questionable background, it turns out.
Yes, very much so.
Because the scrutiny eventually prompted a 2005 investigation by the New York Times, and they uncovered that Pellman had actually falsified, or at best, deeply embellished his medical credentials.
Yeah, he failed to disclose that he attended medical school in Guadalajara, Mexico.
Right, carefully framing his biography to imply he had graduated from a much more prestigious mainstream American institution. This is the individual the NFL entrusted to lead their supposed pursuit of scientific truth.
And if you look at what that committee actually produced under his leadership, the strategy becomes incredibly clear.
What did they produce?
Between 2003 and when he eventually stepped down as chair, the MTBI committee published 16 separate studies. Dr. Pellman was the lead author on 9 of them.
Wow. And what were the conclusions?
Time and time again, across this entire body of self-funded research, they concluded that concussions were not a statistically significant problem. They claimed that no NFL player had ever suffered lasting, permanent brain damage from playing the game.
The source text essentially calls this the Committee of Convenient Ignorance. It seems the NFL realized that having no data looked negligent, so instead they manufactured their own data.
That's exactly what they did.
They generated a massive parallel body of junk science, authored by their own paid employees, reaching conclusions that magically protected their $20 billion business model. And then they pointed to those studies in press conferences as if they were objective truth.
That is the insidious nature of institutional science when it's corrupted by financial incentives.
Right.
By 2010, the political and public pressure became so immense that Congress essentially forced the NFL to disband this committee and create a new, slightly more independent one.
And what did the new committee say?
Well, when the new leadership took over, they had to explicitly admit that Pellman's previous body of work was, in their words, infected.
Infected, wow.
They announced they would build on none of its findings. The league was essentially forced to orchestrate a massive recall of its own 15-year scientific history.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the showdown that happens next in our text. Because this fight couldn't stay contained in medical journals forever, it spills directly into the halls of Capitol Hill.
It does. October 2009.
We are inside a House Judiciary Committee hearing. The lights are glaring, the cameras are rolling, and you have NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell sitting there under oath.
A highly uncomfortable position.
Very. Representative John Conyers is leaning over the microphone, demanding a simple yes or no answer. He asked Goodell point blank, is there a medical link between playing professional football and long-term brain damage?
And Goodell, sitting atop an empire that had just spent a decade aggressively publishing its own medical studies on this exact topic, deflects.
What does he say?
He looks straight at the congressional committee and says, I'm not a medical expert.
Just breathtaking evasion.
Conyers is visibly frustrated. He pushes him, demanding a straight answer, but Goodell simply demurs again, hiding behind this sudden, profound lack of medical authority.
Unbelievable.
Meanwhile, the politicians were incredibly angry because Dr. Ira Kassin, who had served as a co-chair of the NFL's Brain Committee after Pellman, somehow wasn't made available to testify that day.
Convenient.
Very. But the committee didn't let him off the hook. They played video footage of Kassin from a television interview where he was seen repeatedly and explicitly denying any evidentiary link between football head injuries and long-term neurological disorders.
So the contrast between Goodell's I don't know and his own committee's aggressive public denials was jarring. The audacity of Goodell's evasion is just... wow. You are the CEO of an entity that has literally funded a parallel scientific reality for 15 years, demanding retractions of independent scientists' work. But the second a U.S. congressman demands you stand by your own science under oath, you shrink back and say, I'm not a doctor.
But the politicians weren't buying the act.
No, they weren't. During that hearing, Representative Linda Sanchez and a former NFL player named Bernie Parrish explicitly bring up the elephant in the room. The tobacco industry.
The big tobacco playbook.
Parrish literally sits there and calls the NFL's scientific apparatus the emergence of death, which is a direct callback to the tobacco hearings of the 1990s.
And the structural similarities to the big tobacco playbook are profoundly striking. Let's look at the mechanics of it as the source text lays out.
Okay, let's hear it.
Both the tobacco industry and the NFL faced devastating independent scientific research showing that their core product caused irreversible, fatal harm. How did they both respond? First, they created internal, proprietary scientific bodies, staffed by conflicted figures, to manufacture an alternative narrative.
Right.
Second, they aggressively attacked the credibility of outside researchers, just like the NFL tried to destroy Omalu's career.
Check.
And third, they maintained a perpetual public posture of more research is needed. That is the golden phrase. Long after the actual scientific consensus had shifted, they weaponized skepticism to delay regulation and liability.
It is the absolute classic playbook for manufacturing doubt. But if we're going to be rigorously analytical about this, we have to note where the big tobacco parallel starts to strain. Right?
Yes, definitely.
Because it's a great soundbite for a congressional hearing, but it's not a perfect one-to-one analogy. The source material points out some key differences.
It does, and making those distinctions is vital for a clear-eyed understanding. There are two major structural differences.
What's the first one?
Power dynamics. Cigarette smokers in the 1960s and 70s were an anonymous mass consumer base. They had zero institutional leverage against Philip Morris.
Right, it's just everyday people.
But NFL players are unionized employees. They have collective bargaining rights, a players' association, and the theoretical ability to strike. That changes the dynamic of how the hazard is negotiated.
That makes sense. And the second difference?
The second requires intellectual honesty regarding the science. The underlying evidence for CTE in 2009 and even today remains genuinely less settled than the epidemiology of lung cancer was when tobacco executives were hauled before Congress.
Really? How so?
Well, the link between smoking and lung cancer is a massive, undeniable, population-level epidemiological certainty. The CTE research, while incredibly compelling, relies heavily on post-mortem autopsy studies.
Right, because you can only diagnose it after death.
Exactly. And those studies carry inherent unavoidable selection biases, which we will unpack in detail shortly. So while the corporate playbook of doubt was identical, the maturity and shape of the underlying science were quite different.
And that nuance is exactly why the pressure from Congress didn't immediately result in sweeping federal laws shutting down the sport. But it did break the dam of public perception.
It absolutely did.
It gave the players the ammunition they needed, and it led directly to the players fighting back in the only arena that actually matters to a $20 billion corporation, the courts.
The lawsuits.
Yes. By 2013, over 4,500 former NFL players have filed a massive, consolidated class action lawsuit against the league, alleging a systemic, decades-long cover-up.
And this legal pressure forces a historic financial settlement.
Initially, the two sides agreed to a massive number, $765 million. But there is a massive catch.
Right, the payout is strictly capped.
And crucially, the NFL agrees to this settlement while officially admitting zero liability. They write a check, but they cannot admit they did anything wrong.
The structure of that initial cap settlement was highly controversial and, functionally, a ticking time bomb for the player.
Why is that?
Think about the mechanics of a progressive neurological disease. If you have a fixed pool of $765 million and an unknown number of thousands of former players who might develop severe symptoms over the next 40 to 50 years, the math simply doesn't work.
The money runs out.
Exactly. The money could easily run out within the first decade. The early claimants get paid, while the players who develop symptoms 20 years down the line get absolutely nothing.
That's incredibly unfair.
Because of this glaring inequity, U.S. District Judge Anita Brody actually intervened. In 2014, she rejected the initial settlement, recognizing that a hard cap on a progressive disease was fundamentally unjust to the younger retired players.
So sent back to the drawing board, the NFL removes the cap. Suddenly, actuarial projections hit the news saying this could cost the league roughly $1 billion over a 65-year lifespan.
Which sounds like a massive victory.
On the surface, yes. If you were reading the headlines, it sounds like a total win for the players. But when you actually peel back the legal layers and look at the fine print, the NFL executed an absolute masterclass in risk mitigation.
They really did, because there was a stunning exclusion in this revised deal.
Yes. CTE itself, the specific disease Bennet Omalu discovered in Mike Webster, the exact pathology driving this entire national crisis, was explicitly excluded from future compensation.
It is one of the most consequential and frankly baffling structural choices in the entire saga. Let's break down how this actually worked.
Please do.
Under the terms of the settlement, if a player had already died and been posthumously diagnosed with CTE before the final settlement date was approved, their estate could receive a payout.
Okay, so the past deaths were covered.
Right. But any future deaths, any player who dies of CTE a year, 5 years, or 20 years after the settlement, completely walled off. Zero compensation for the CTE diagnosis itself.
That is just wild.
An NFL attorney named Bruce Barenboim stood before the court and successfully argued that the underlying science of CTE was still in its infancy. He argued that the diagnostic criteria were too muddy, and if they allowed CTE claims, every single case would be bogged down in endless medical trials.
It's an absurdity of the highest order. Think about it. It's exactly like a massive chemical plant getting sued by a local town because a toxic spill poisoned the water supply, right?
Right.
The chemical company agrees to $1 billion settlement to make the lawsuit go away, but their lawyers quietly insert a clause that says, we will pay for general sickness, but we categorically refuse to pay anyone who actually tests positive for the specific chemical we spilled.
That analogy hits the nail precisely on the head. The settlement allowed for payouts based on observable clinical symptoms and specific diagnoses like ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and severe dementia.
But not CTE.
Right. CTE itself, which one plaintiff's attorney vividly described as football's industrial disease, was entirely removed as a standalone trust for compensation moving forward.
So they essentially made their biggest liability just disappear.
Thomas Demetrio, another attorney involved in the litigation, noted bluntly that the NFL had successfully engineered a masterstroke. They crafted a deal where they never had to open their files in discovery, they never had to admit what they knew, and their most terrifying liability, CTE, just went poof.
Oof.
Evaporated from the ledger.
Evaporated.
And if you thought the ink drying on the settlement was the end of the story, the actual administration of this billion-dollar fund over the next decade turned into an absolute nightmare of bureaucracy, bad faith, and outright fraud.
A total mess.
By the time we hit the mid-2020s, the settlement is riddled with systemic, deeply troubling issues. On one side, you have the NFL aggressively using every possible medical loophole to deny legitimate claims from suffering players.
Right.
But the most horrifying revelation to come out of this administrative process was the discovery of something called racial norming. Really need to pause on this because it's incredibly sinister in its application.
It is genuinely shocking when you read how it worked. So if you are a former player applying for a payout for dementia, you have to undergo rigorous cognitive testing to prove your mental decline, right?
Correct.
But our source material reveals that the testing formula the NFL was using, mathematically, assumed that black players possessed a lower baseline level of intelligence and cognitive function than white players.
It was an egregious, mathematically embedded bias. To understand the mechanics of it, to qualify for a payout, a player had to demonstrate a significant drop in cognitive function from their presumed baseline before they started playing.
Right.
Because the baseline for black players was artificially set lower by this algorithm, a black player had to demonstrate a much, much steeper, more catastrophic cognitive decline to trigger a payout compared to a white player with the exact same test scores.
That is just evil. It essentially built a mathematical wall that made it statistically much harder for black players who make up the vast majority of the league to prove their cognitive decline and access the funds.
The public outcry was immense, and the league was eventually forced to abandon the practice, but it highlighted the deeply adversarial nature of a settlement that was supposed to be reparative. The text notes that doctors working directly for the NFL routinely overruled the independent board-certified physicians who had actually examined the suffering players in person.
But the dysfunction wasn't purely on the NFL's side, was it? The system was being actively gamed from the other direction, too.
Yes, that is the tragic reality of a massive, complex compensation fund. By 2026, investigations documented massive, coordinated fraud on the claimant side.
How so?
The special masters appointed by the court to oversee the fund had to officially bar 5 different law firms from participating. Why? Because these firms were caught fraudulently steering nearly 100 former players to a handful of compromised doctors.
And what were the doctors doing?
They would essentially rubber stamp fake Parkinson's disease diagnoses. They were generating fraudulent medical paperwork just to trigger massive 6- or 7-figure payouts, of which the law firms would take a massive cut. So the settlement, which was born out of tragedy and a demand for accountability, became this corrupted, cynical battleground, gamed mercilessly from both directions. It severely complicates any tidy Hollywood narrative that the settlement was purely a triumph of justice for the victims.
So while the lawyers are fighting over money, payouts, algorithms, and fraudulent claims in the courtrooms, the actual physical reality of the disease is quietly accumulating in a freezer in Massachusetts.
Right.
We shift our focus to Boston University. A neuropathologist named Dr. Anne McKee is assembling what will rapidly become the world's largest brain bank dedicated exclusively to the study of CTE. And the astonishing growth of this repository isn't driven by NFL funding or government grants initially. It is driven by sheer, unadulterated grief.
It is a scientific repository built entirely on a foundation of human tragedy. And the turning point for public awareness hinges on 2 incredibly high-profile, devastating suicides.
The text goes into this, and it's heartbreaking.
In 2011, Dave Duerson, a former safety for the Chicago Bears who had won a Super Bowl and was deeply respected around the league, took his own life. But the manner in which he did it was a profound, horrifying message.
Yeah.
He shot himself in the chest, explicitly to preserve his brain. He left a suicide note specifically demanding that his brain be sent to the Boston University Brain Bank for study.
He knew something was fundamentally broken inside his head.
He knew. He wanted the science to prove it. And then the very next year, in 2012, Junior Seau, one of the most beloved, charismatic Hall of Fame linebackers in the history of the sport, also died by suicide using the exact same method, shot to the chest.
And his family immediately donated his brain to Dr. McKee's team.
They did.
Those donations fundamentally transformed the act of giving one's brain. It was no longer an obscure clinical request buried in an organ donor form. It became a profound posthumous act of advocacy. It was players trapped in their own failing minds, speaking from beyond the grave to warn the next generation.
And what Dr. McKee's team found as these donations poured in was nothing short of staggering. In 2017, they published a landmark shockwave of a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association.
Jamie.
Yes. They examined 202 donated brains from deceased football players, and they found CTE in 99% of the brains that came from former NFL players.
Let me repeat that for the listeners. 99%.
And as the years went on, the raw numbers only grew. By 2023, Dr. McKee's team had examined 376 brains specifically from former NFL players. Of those 376, an astonishing 91.7% of them had positive, undeniable diagnoses of CTE.
Those numbers are just massive.
They are. But beyond the raw percentages, Dr. McKee's research established something critical for understanding the mechanism of the disease, a clear, undeniable dose-response relationship.
What does that mean in this context?
They determined that every 2.6 years of playing tackle football, at any level, youth, high school, college, or pro, effectively doubles your risk of developing CTE. The longer you play, the more hits you absorb, the exponentially greater the risk becomes.
Oh, every 2.6 years.
Exactly. And to prove to the skeptics that this wasn't just some general human condition or a byproduct of modern living, they cross-referenced their findings with the Framingham Heart Study, which provided a massive general population cohort.
Okay, so a control group.
Right. Out of 164 brains from the general non-football playing population, how many had CTE? Exactly one. And that single anomalous individual happened to be a former college football player.
Unbelievable. Now, if you are a listener hearing these numbers, 99%, 91.7%, doubling risk every 2.6 years, it sounds like an absolute death sentence for anyone who straps on a helmet. The numbers seem utterly definitive.
Right.
But we have to pump the brakes. We need to be rigorously careful here, just as the researchers themselves are, to explain the massive, crucial caveat built into this research.
Yes, this is so important. We have to talk about selection bias. This is an absolutely vital concept for responsible scientific literacy, and it's something the media routinely botched in their breathless
The
coverage.
media definitely ran with it.
They did. But the researchers at Boston University, Dr. McKee foremost among them, have constantly, explicitly, and loudly warned the public that 99% of donated brains is absolutely, fundamentally not the same thing as 99% of all NFL players who have ever played the game.
Right. Because think about human nature. Families generally only go through the emotional trauma of donating a loved one's brain if they've observed deeply disturbing behavioral changes or rapid cognitive decline during that person's life.
Precisely.
If your grandfather played 10 years in the NFL as a lineman and lived to be 85 years old with a perfectly sharp memory, playing golf and doing crosswords, you probably aren't calling the brain bank in Boston when he passes away from natural causes.
Exactly. The sample pool in the Boston University freezers is heavily artificially enriched with severe cases, precisely because of who chooses to initiate the donation process. The data is skewed toward the tragic outcomes.
The problem was that the mainstream media frequently dropped this vital qualifier. They ran massive chyrons and screaming headlines implying that 99% of all players get the disease, which is a statistical leap the underlying data simply cannot support.
Yeah, the finding is still genuinely alarming. It definitively proves a strong causal link between the sport and the disease. But untangling the exaggerated apocalyptic claims from the rigorously caveated actual science became a massive issue in the public discourse.
Which leads us directly into one of the most fascinating and frankly uncomfortable human elements of this entire saga. Because the science is incredibly complex, but as it turns out in the text, the man who started it all, Dr. Bennet Omalu, the man who looked at Mike Webster's brain, is equally complex and deeply flawed.
He really is. Our material dedicates significant space to exploring the frictions surrounding Omalu, particularly highlighting a massive 2020 investigation by the Washington Post that really fractured the prevailing heroic narrative.
What did the Post find?
According to exhaustive interviews with dozens of leading neurodegenerative experts across the country, a wide consensus emerged that Omalu had wildly exaggerated his own claims and severely overstated the established risks of CTE to the general public.
So he was kind of doing what the media was doing.
Exactly. He was making absolute, definitive statements about the prevalence of the disease that went far beyond what the pathology could actually prove.
The investigation even revealed that Omalu didn't actually invent the term CTE, did he?
No, he didn't.
The term had been used in medical literature decades earlier regarding boxing, which completely contradicts his own cultivated legend of naming the disease.
And then there was the intense, ugly professional friction between him and Dr. Ann McKee. The Post reported that in his own personal writing, Omalu dismissively referred to McKee as the blonde white woman who was attempting to steal his credit and his spotlight.
That is just awful.
McKee, for her part, flatly denied ever trying to take credit for his initial discovery. She was just doing the systemic, large-scale research he wasn't doing. It's a classic, tragic case of professional jealousy, massive ego, and groundbreaking science all mixing into a toxic stew.
And this nuanced, messy human complexity was completely erased by the machinery of Hollywood, wasn't it?
Completely erased.
In 2015, a major motion picture called Concussion, starring Will Smith as Bennet Omalu, hits theaters.
Right.
As observers of culture, we understand that commercial cinema requires narrative compression. But the movie took compression to an extreme. It flattened Omalu into a flawless, saintly hero, single-handedly crusading for truth against all odds.
And it flattened the NFL into a cartoonish, monolithic villain sitting in smoke-filled rooms plotting his demise.
It erased Ann McKee entirely. It erased the nuance of selection bias.
But, it's a profound observation on how modern society digests complex scientific information. The hard truth is we need simple emotional narratives to pay attention.
We really do. The movie might have been scientifically flattened, and it might have skipped over the critical nuances of how epidemiology actually works, but it accomplished something peer-reviewed journals never could. It put the letters CTE into the vocabulary of tens of millions of ordinary people.
It made it a household conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was culturally essential for breaking the NFL's wall of silence, even if it was scientifically simplified.
But while Hollywood was making dramatic movies and the public was learning the acronym, the NFL was quietly adapting its strategy. Because when you are a $20 billion entity and flat-out denial of the science no longer works in the public square, how do you maintain control of the narrative?
You pivot.
You pivot. You use your immense wealth. The analysis shows that the lead shifted to using philanthropy as a weapon of influence.
Okay, we have to talk about the NIH stunt, because this is corporate machination at its absolute finest.
It really is.
In 2012, the NFL very publicly, with great fanfare, gives a $30 million grant to the National Institutes of Health, the premier medical research agency of the U.S. government. They announce it as an unrestricted gift with no strings attached. It looks like incredible corporate generosity, a league finally taking responsibility and funding the search for a cure.
But jump forward to 2015.
Right.
The NIH wants to fund a massive $16 million 7-year study to try and find a way to diagnose CTE in living patients. Right now, you can only definitively diagnose it by slicing open the brain after death. Finding a living diagnosis is the holy grail of this research. It would change everything.
So the NIH goes through its rigorous selection process and chooses Dr. Robert Stern, a prominent researcher from Boston University, to lead the study. And suddenly, the NFL remembers they actually kept a massive hidden veto string attached to their supposedly unrestricted money.
Yes. Dr. Stern had previously been quoted in the media making statements highly critical of Commissioner Roger Goodell and the league's handling of the crisis. So the NFL balked.
Can they even do that?
Well, technically, the contract between the NFL and the NIH didn't allow the league to explicitly pick and choose which specific researchers got funded. But it did include a clause giving the NFL the right to pull their entire funding partnership with 30 days' notice.
Ah.
They used this backdoor nuclear leverage to effectively veto Dr. Stern. They whispered to the NIH, if he leads the study, we pull the $30 million.
Wow. And what did the NIH do?
The NIH leadership was so frustrated and offended by this breach of scientific independence that they ended up funding Dr. Stern's $16 million study using taxpayer money instead. They eventually severed ties with the NFL entirely, leaving roughly $16 million of the original gift sitting unspent.
It's a perfect example of control disguised as charity. They didn't have to go through the messy public fight of demanding a retraction of a published study like they did in 2005. They just tried to financially starve the researcher they didn't like before he could even turn on the lights in his lab.
Precisely. This is how sophisticated institutional influence actually operates in the modern era. It's subtle. It's structural. You don't argue with the data. You simply control which questions are allowed to be asked, and you control who gets the massive resources required to ask them.
So if the NFL won't fund independent living diagnosis studies by their critics, what does the league enthusiastically fund and promote?
Helmets?
Helmets. Specifically, engineering solutions like the Guardian caps. If you've watched an NFL training camp or practice recently, you've seen them. They're these bulky, puffy, soft-shell padded covers that players strap over the outside of their hard helmets.
The NFL mandated them for practice, proudly claiming in press releases that they reduce the force of impact by up to 20%.
But our source material brings in a massive peer-reviewed reality check on this technological optimism.
Yes, let's look at the actual data. A massive 2025 study conducted by researchers at the University of Wisconsin tracked over 2,600 high school football athletes. They wanted to see if these Guardian caps actually moved the needle in the real world. The results were damning. They found that wearing these Guardian caps during practice had absolutely zero statistical effect on the actual rate of concussions. None.
Zero.
The real-world field conditions, the chaos, the angles, the speed, did not match the controlled laboratory force reduction claims. Even an internal NFL study, buried in the fine print, concluded that the overall long-term safety benefits of the caps were uncertain.
But the NFL mandates them for practice anyway, and here's the craziest part. They keep them largely optional for the actual games, where the speed is highest and the most violent hits happen.
Right.
Why? Because the Guardian caps are ugly. They ruin the sleek, gladiatorial aesthetic of the NFL uniform. It feels entirely like liability management and PR, not actual neurological safety.
Exactly. Why does the NFL love funding helmet engineering so much? Because it creates the powerful illusion of a solution. It allows them to say, look, we are using space-age technology to fix the problem without ever requiring them to admit that the basic physics of football is the problem.
Think about the biomechanics. No amount of exterior foam padding, no matter how advanced, can stop the soft tissue of the human brain from violently sloshing around inside the hard bone of the skull when a 220-pound player goes from running 20 miles per hour to a dead stop in a fraction of a second.
It just can't.
The brain still hits the inside of the skull. The helmet protects the bone from fracturing. It does practically nothing to stop the internal deceleration that tears the tau protein loose.
Which brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of this entire deep dive. If space-age helmets don't actually solve the problem, what does?
The text is very clear on this.
The medical intervention with the strongest, most undeniable evidentiary backing is incredibly simple, incredibly boring, and fundamentally threatens the entire macho culture of football. Just hit less.
Right. Restrict the amount of physical contact.
The data on this is overwhelming. A 2019 study out of Wisconsin showed that simply implementing state rules that strictly limited the amount of full contact practice time dropped the rate of practice concussions by a staggering 57%.
57%. That is huge.
And a 2021 CDC study looked at the youth level. They showed that kids playing tackle football take 15 times more head impacts during a season than kids playing flag football.
The science is screaming at us with a megaphone. If you want to protect young, developing brains from long-term neurological rot, you delay the age at which they start hitting each other.
But that simple, scientifically backed solution is exactly where the fiercest legislative and cultural war is currently happening.
Tell us about the state bills.
State legislatures in progressive strongholds like California, New York, Illinois, and Massachusetts have introduced bills attempting to ban tackle football for children under the age of 12. And this is where the dynamic becomes truly fascinating from a sociological perspective.
Yeah, because the NFL itself, a $20 billion corporation with the most to lose, doesn't really have to deploy an army of lobbyists to kill these bills, do they?
No, they don't.
I was struck by this detail. Why is the NFL sitting back and letting local parents fight this existential battle for them? It seems to me that the NFL doesn't need to hire lobbyists because they've spent a century building a cultural moat so deep and so wide that local citizens will do their PR for free. Is that what we're seeing on the ground?
That is exactly what is happening. The corporate entity can remain silent because the grassroots culture organically mobilizes to protect the sport. Our material details how organizations like Save Youth Football and conservative parental rights groups like Moms for Liberty rally fiercely against these legislative bans.
Now, to be strictly objective about their positions, these grassroots organizations oppose the state restrictions based on fundamental arguments about parental rights, civic tradition, and the deeply held belief that the rigorous physical nature of tackle football builds essential resilience, discipline, and toughness in young men.
Exactly. They pack the State House hearing rooms. They show up wearing their kids' team jerseys. They testify passionately.
And the NFL immensely benefits from this cultural resistance without having to orchestrate it, fund it, or put their corporate logo on it. The local grassroots culture passionately protects the corporate product entirely for free.
It is brilliant in its insulation. The economic and cultural ecosystem of high school and youth football is so deeply entrenched in the American identity. It's tied to town pride, to Friday night lights, to coming-of-age rituals, that the league can just quietly watch from the sidelines while parents passionately fight the government for their right to let their 10-year-olds absorb subconcussive head impacts.
However, despite that loud, highly visible grassroots defense at the state houses, a massive, quiet demographic shift is happening across the country. We are witnessing a slow-motion restructuring of the sport.
We really are.
Right, because for every parent yelling at a town hall meeting, there are a dozen parents looking at the CTE data, looking at their kid, and making a quiet, binding decision at the kitchen table.
And the numbers reflect this withdrawal. Pop Warner, which is historically the biggest and most famous youth tackle league in the country, saw their participation drop by 9.5% between 2010 and 2012 alone, right as the CTE news was breaking.
Wow.
By 2021, the number of kids playing high school tackle football dropped below 1 million players for the first time this century. The parents are voting with their minivans. They aren't waiting for the government to ban it. They were just silently pulling their kids out.
And they aren't abandoning the sport of football entirely, are they? They are migrating, and the beneficiary of this migration is flag football.
The growth metrics there are astonishing. By 2025, flag football became officially recognized as the fastest-growing youth sport in America.
And the massive driver of that growth was among young girls, right? The sport saw a 63% increase in female participation over a 4-year window. The momentum is so undeniable that flag football was officially added to the slate for the 2028 Olympic Games in Los Angeles.
And the NFL, showing their corporate agility, isn't fighting this flag football trend. They are aggressively co-opting it.
They heavily fund and promote a program called NFL Flag. They are reading the cultural tea leaves and essentially making a compromise with American parents. They are saying, okay, we hear you, keep your kids safe, let them play NFL Flag when they are 7, 8, 9, and 10 years old. Learn the routes, buy the jerseys, watch the games on Sunday, and we'll see you in tackle gear when their brains are a bit more developed and they get to high school.
And the demographic data backs up this strategy. Tackle football still absolutely dominates the landscape among 13 to 17-year-olds. Parents are restructuring the pipeline to protect their kids' brains during those crucial early developmental years. A 2016 poll conducted by UMass found that a staggering 78% of Americans do not want kids playing tackle football before age 14.
That 78% figure is a supermajority. It is a profound data point. It proves that despite the NFL's 15-year, multi-million-dollar campaign of engineered doubt, despite the rheumatologists and the junk science and the congressional deflections, the fundamental truth still reached the public. The science penetrated the mainstream consciousness. You cannot put the genie back in the bottle.
So we have to pull the lens back and ask the ultimate question. Why did it take 15 grueling years of scientific trench warfare to get to this point of cultural recalibration?
You have to follow the money. We are talking about a machine that generates $20 billion in annual revenue. Think about that billion-dollar concussion settlement we discussed earlier.
Right.
It sounds like an astronomical penalty to an average person. But in the context of the NFL's ledger, $1 billion spread over 65 years is practically a rounding error. It is roughly equivalent to one single season of sponsorship revenue for the league. They were never facing an existential financial threat from the lawsuits. They were merely managing reputational control and preserving their broadcast product.
And we cannot ignore the role of media complicity in protecting that revenue stream. The broadcast networks are not neutral observers. They are financial partners.
What does the text say about ESPN?
It highlights a glaring historical example of this conflict of interest. In 2013, PBS Frontline was producing a massive, groundbreaking documentary about the CTE crisis called League of Denial. Initially, ESPN was a partner on the project, sharing resources and reporters. But right before the documentary aired, under immense pressure from the NFL, ESPN abruptly pulled its name, its logo, and its promotional support from the project.
Just completely bailed.
Yes. The implication was deafeningly clear. You do not bite the hand that feeds you multi-billion-dollar live broadcast rights. The entire television sports architecture is structurally built on presenting the violent collisions of football as thrilling, harmless entertainment, not as a documented progressive health hazard.
It's not just the NFL executives and the TV network presidents either.
Yeah.
The resistance to safety reform is baked into regional economies across the country. Think about major college towns, places like Tuscaloosa, Ann Arbor, Columbus, where the massive revenue from the football program subsidizes the entire athletic department, the university's marketing, and the local hospitality industry. Think about small towns in Texas, Ohio, or Pennsylvania, where the high school Friday night game anchors the local economy for the entire fall season. The institutional resistance to admitting football destroys brains isn't just about stubbornness or macho pride. It's about massive layered economic dependency, stretching from the luxury suites in Manhattan all the way down to the local diner in West Texas.
To truly contextualize the NFL's behavior, it is vital to look at how peer sports handled similar crises. Because the NFL's path of denial was not inevitable. It was a specific series of choices.
Let's look at those comparisons.
Look at World Rugby. When faced with mounting epidemiological evidence of brain trauma, they moved much faster to implement global rules limiting tackle height and drastically reducing full contact training to protect their players.
What about the NHL?
The NHL faced their own massive concussion lawsuit from former players, but they managed to settle it for a mere $19 million, and they did it without ever including CTE compensation, navigating the legal minefield much more quietly.
And then look at boxing, the sport where this all started in 1928. Boxing has known about permanent brain damage for nearly 100 years and has essentially done nothing structurally to stop it. largely because boxers lack a cohesive union, collective bargaining power, and the mainstream corporate sponsorship that forces accountability. The comparison shows that the NFL had options, and they chose the path of maximum resistance.
Pulling all of these threads together, from Mike Webster on a coroner's table to the halls of Congress to the kitchen tables of American parents, we have to reckon with the culture of toughness itself.
We really do. Football is deeply, inextricably woven into the mythology of American masculinity. It is the closest thing we have to a secular religion. Admitting that the core mechanism of the sport literally destroys the minds of the men playing it requires a painful, fundamental unwinding of that mythology. It forces us to ask what we are willing to sacrifice for entertainment.
And in doing so, we must pause to honor the human toll, the tragedy of the men who lost their mind while the league they built actively denied their reality. The suicides of Durison and So, the agonizing early-onset dementia, the absolute devastation of families who had to sit helplessly and watch their strong, vibrant heroes disintegrate in their 40s and 50s. These were not statistical abstractions on a rheumatologist's spreadsheet. They were human beings sacrificed to an institution that clearly prioritized the protection of the shield over the protection of the brain.
And perhaps the most poignant takeaway is that the ultimate verdict on this 15-year war isn't going to come from a congressional committee mandate or a federal judge's gavel or even a medical journal.
No, it won't.
The verdict is happening right now. It is a slow, accumulating, relentless withdrawal of consent by parents across America, child by child, family by family, sport by sport.
Exactly.
But as we watch this demographic shift, I want to leave you, the listener, with a provocative thought to mull over. A question that this data begs but doesn't quite answer.
It's an important question.
If middle-class parents, armed with 99% CTE studies and 57% concussion reduction statistics, continue to pull their kids out of youth tackle football and shift them to flag, what happens to the tackle game?
Right.
Will the sport eventually become an arena of physical sacrifice, populated almost exclusively by young men who desperately need the economic mobility of a college scholarship? When the medical risk is completely known and the affluent opt out, who is left to assume that risk?
It is definitely something to think about.
I've been Amy, and joining me as always is Sam. This entire conversation is derived from the first book of the 30-volume series, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America, the book titled Volume 1, America's Healthcare Crisis and Broken Public Institutions, authored by Sue B. Howell.
The book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We enthusiastically encourage you to go check out the book, leave comments, and share your feedback. Thank you for listening.